So thank you everyone for tuning in to yet another episode in which I talk about issues related to public transport. I have had gaps in coverage due to a bunch of meetings that I was at. Now I can't tell you how important these meetings were. I know who was at the meeting. I'm not gonna say who because it's all confidential. Just don't think it's by itself that illuminating. We'll see soon how seriously people in power in the United States take our transit costs recommendations. This does need to not have typos. URLs with typos are bad because if you try to do a URL with a typo, it will most likely get you to spam/porn/virus site. By the way, this event that we did on Friday a week ago, it was recorded, but unfortunately the sound quality in the recording was too bad to post. So if people want to know what happened at the event, best place to go is to go to my blog where I did upload the slides. And this is not what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about some kind of, I don't want to call it malicious compliance. It's really an intersection between a form of malicious compliance and other people's money, which is, as mentioned, excessive. I don't want to say excessive compliance with regulation so much as people. The issue is how high costs can come from people for a combination of understandable and stupid reasons. Demand things that are more than required by regulation. So what do we mean by more than required by regulation? For example, accessibility. In order to provide public transport and other services to various classes of disabled people, there are engineering standards for what is required. For example, by far the most important of this from a cost perspective is that every train station needs to have an elevator so that you can get on the train without ever climbing up or down steps, nor by using escalators, which are sometimes okay, but not if you're in a wheelchair generally. So there are people who should not be using steps. For example, you might be able to see from my background that I'm back home. So flying from the United States to Germany, there was a lot of luggage involved. So steps were not good, but escalators were okay. But if you're in a wheelchair, they're not okay. This was actually a big thing in America in the 1970s when they were building the Washington Metro. There was this kind of, escalators are still okay, let me demonstrate kind of reaction, and that did not work out well, and this is why they instead did elevators, and I think that was one of the things that led later to the mandate for elevators in American law. Now the mandates for accessibility, the engineering standards for them differ by country, but usually the differences are things like the exact definition of the slope that is considered accessible. These definitions generally tighten. The accessibility laws generally get tighter as the standards get higher. But again, the main cost item is installing the elevator, and that is not really a standard. It's just you need to have an elevator. And by the way, I will say that American standards are not unusually tight on this. Essentially, Spanish standards for maximum slope, they're a hair tighter than American ones, defined a little bit differently, but in practice a hair tighter. Norwegian ones are the ones where I actually can tell you the slope. It's supposed to be nowadays 1 in 20. In the United States is in practice 1 in 13. So it's not that the regulations themselves are too tight. Another thing that we've been asked about so often, it's probably the second most common false explanation. So the most common, completely false. I don't mean maybe there is something to it, but it's exaggerated, like some labor questions. Here's an example of something that I have seen repeatedly from a lot of Americans as the obvious reason they say why American costs are higher than European ones, and this is, to be very clear, complete bullshit, and this is healthcare costs. So it is well known that the United States has very high healthcare expenditures, that these healthcare expenditures are fairly privatized. I think American healthcare costs are about 50-50 between public and private. This is the most, this is the highest share of the private sector in the developed democratic world. And because universal healthcare is such a looming issue in American politics, there's this belief that it would also fix construction costs. It's complete bullshit. To the point that you have people like important people in management and in union activism in the United States. I shouldn't say activism. It was the head of the transport workers union in New York on the subway, John Samuelson, who said French employers don't have to pay healthcare and pensions. And again, this is complete bullshit. In fact, the benefits ratio in Europe is basically the same as in the American public sector. For every euro you earn in salary, in gross salary, the employer has to spend about €1 more on your existence, which is split between taxes and other benefits, which include often and-on healthcare. This is a standard job benefit in France. So again, the number one completely false explanation is there's this weird belief among Americans that Europe doesn't make employers pay for social benefits because they're funded out of taxes, which is silly because yes, they're funded out of taxes, but these are flat payroll taxes generally. So the second most common false explanation that I have seen is the issue of fire code. The United States has a fire code which is called NFPA. The one for subway stations is called NFPA 130. It's called it is a standard. It's a set of standards for fire escape, and these are often held by Americans to be a very onerous set of regulations. And this is in fact compounded by the fact that Japan has a completely different type of fire code. Essentially a fire code that's much more specific about what is and is not compliant, where the American fire code is much vaguer. And because the United States and Japan both try to export their systems abroad, you can hear from JICA, from Japan, why its approach is superior. And this leads Americans to say, oh yeah, we can't do it because unlike Japan, we have fire codes. FYI, NFPA 130 is also the current fire code in Turkey. And for so for the earthquake that happened recently, 5 to 6 figures number of people died. Let me actually check if there are more. Turkey earthquake death toll. The death toll has surpassed 50,000 people. Yeah, and here they're saying 55,000 deaths on Wikipedia. Now in Turkey, there are, I believe, 400,000 construction companies and contractors. So it's very small business. It's a country of 80 million people. So these are small builders. They're not very well regulated. There are very strong earthquake laws in Turkey, but if you're building a small apartment building, they will be ignored. However, big things like a metro station, like a metro line in Istanbul, yeah, that's not going to be a random small builder. These are given to large companies that also successfully do business abroad, and these have to pass fire code. In Turkey, again, they use the same fire code as the United States. Actually, not quite, because they use the tighter of two standards. One is NFPA 130, which is for transit systems, and the other is NFPA, I believe, 107, which is for buildings. The rule for Turkish subway systems is you look at these two fire codes, whichever is more stringent applies for every specific thing. Likewise, in China, they use NFPA 130. In Spain, they use 1FPA 130 with some modifications, but I've not heard that these modifications necessarily make it cheaper. So how come and yet people in the United States are convinced the fire code is important. So why? The first reason could just be malice. This is something that you see a lot with the issue of accessibility, where I have heard people who should have known better say that American costs are rising because of ADA standards. This is Americans with Disabilities Act. But again, yeah, every new subway station in the United States has to have elevator accessibility, but this is also true of every new subway station anywhere. Go out and see the world. Like, I mean, not only that, but in the city that I live in Berlin, we were supposed to have completed elevator retrofits at every station last year. This has not happened. Let me actually check. U-Bahn Berlin Aufzug. And it was supposed to happen 2022 again. I think it's going to be in a few years. Aufzug. Let's see if it's going to be 2023. Right, so they said until 2023 and 2017, and again, that's being busted, unfortunately. But busted by a few years, not decades. Berlin currently is 80% accessible. The U-Bahn, just as a reminder, opened 1902, 2 years before the New York City subway. The cost of doing all 30 remaining stations combined is probably going to be, I'm guessing, about 100 million euros. I haven't seen cost estimates for all of them, only for some, so I need to make some guesswork. I believe it's going to be 100-ish million euros, which is about equivalent to 2 subway stations in New York City. And so in Berlin, not only is everything new accessible, but the old stuff is getting accessible. In Madrid, not only is everything new accessible, but the old stuff is slightly slower than in Berlin, but only slightly becoming accessible. Milan, Barcelona, in Stockholm, I believe they've already done this on the entire older parts of the system. In Seoul, it's 90-something%. There have been riots about this by some disability advocates over the fact that it's not already 100%, because again, the standards get tighter, people's expectations get higher. People in a country like the United States or Germany expect not to be destitute by American or German standards, and if you tell them, based on the standards of minimum subsistence designed in the early 1900s, you're all doing okay, they would just tell you to kindly fuck yourself. So people just, again, expect more in well-run countries. And so in the United States, yeah, they say, the ADA is a problem, essentially out of some kind of hate for people with disabilities, which is endemic to New York City. It's terrible. Everyone is trying to make excuses why they cannot do it without billions and tens of billions of dollars, most of which will leak to things that are not accessibility. Now, this is not a video about leakage. I might do a video on leakage, actually, it's really important. But this is about excessive compliance. So what I mean by excessive compliance, I've mentioned elevators, I've mentioned fire code, and I'm going to give you examples. So with accessibility, the excessive compliance in question is when you spend too much money on building to more than the required standard. So there are, and not only that, but also it's usually not about future-proofing. So what do I mean by not about future-proofing? So maybe you've heard that the slope regulations are there's discussions about tightening them, or maybe you know that there's a range and maybe they should be tighter, or maybe the gap between the train and the platform is a little bit jank, and the standards should tighten on that, and you're thinking ahead of where the standards might tighten. This is legit. It's something that I think should be costed out. Again, very transparently saying, okay, if we expect this capacity, we need to do X. If we expect that capacity, we need to do Y. The same, I think, should be true of questions about future standards. I don't think I've seen this happen in Europe. I've certainly never seen this happen in the United States, where discussions of costs are, as a rule, never transparent. These are all people who believe in government secrecy. These are all people who think that telling other people what they're doing is like makes them no longer in charge somehow. And if you think that I'm portraying the sort of overclass at American transit agencies and regulators as people who are at best useless and at worst malevolent, this is correct. They are, in fact, that. Now emphasis is on malicious compliance. Malicious compliance is when you're deliberately, it's the anti-regulatory equivalent of something that is called an Italian strike, or maybe work to rule, when it's done by unionized or wishing to be unionized workers, when they essentially interpret the statutes of their employment contract in the narrowest way possible. So if the employment contract doesn't say you need to answer the phones, they will just not answer the phones. And then when called upon to, but the contract doesn't tell us you can answer the phones. Usually done by people who don't think that the boss will lay them off for being obviously malicious. So this is an example of malicious compliance. Or if the boss demands to be informed about safety issues, if there's a false alarm, you will essentially make every false alarm an important decision to just jam the manager's time. It's essentially a power flex. So you can also do malicious compliance with regulations. At least from what I've heard, this is not actually malicious compliance. It's the intersection of it with something else, which is other people's money. And again, this is never about what if the standards are tightened. For example, the slope standards may be tightened. I have not heard of any case in the United States of excessive money being thrown on slopes for wheelchair ramps that are gentler than the requirement. Remember, the American requirement is 1 in 13, which is actually a 1 in 12 with every 1 foot of rise. It's 12 feet of run per 1 foot of rise. So every time you ascend 30 centimeters, it's over 3 meters 60. And then every time that happens, afterward there needs to be a flat section 1 foot long. So it averages out to 1 in 13, or it's 1 in open paren, 12 plus 1 close paren. So now again, the standards are sometimes tighter in Spain, I think, for long enough slopes. That's supposed to be, I want to say 6% maybe? Maybe 7% is for intermediate ones, and then in Norway it's 5%. Again, I've never heard of Americans spending too much money just on making the slopes gentler. They spend too much money on other things, and in accessibility, it's partly leakage, which is not the topic of this video, and it's partly redundancy. It's building too many elevators, often 2 where you need 1. Now, if you want to build 2 elevators to have nicer facilities, go ahead, if you can afford to do so. Madrid is doing that. Plan de accesibilidad, not accessia, I don't speak accessibilidad. Plan de accesibilidad inclusión 2021 to 2028, because I can read Spanish phonetically, but I cannot think in real time how to read Spanish numbers. And you don't need to read all of this. You need to look at, so they have the expected costs, which are 16 to 30 million euros, but these are all transfer stations. Transfer stations require more elevators because you need to get to multiple platforms. And note also that this is for things that are not elevators. This is basically free. The costs are largely things that are largely elevator elevator installations, and the costs. Let me see. Do they actually have costs? Okay, yeah. So they have for some, and they will also tell you how many not escalators, elevators. Again, this is Spanish transparency standards, not American ones. And it's never 3. One station is 2. It's usually 4. Now, normally in a station, in most of the world, you need 3 elevators. The reason is that you don't go direct from the street to the platform. There's usually a mezzanine level, small one, not full length. But so this, and there are also fare barriers. In Germany, of course, there are no fare barriers, but this is pretty unique to this part of the world. And I don't even mean this part of the world, I mean this part of Europe, maybe. So in Berlin, you can get away with 1 elevator, but normally you need more than 1 because you have before and after the fare barriers, and also usually you have side platforms, not an island platform. Each platform needs an elevator. So that's 3 elevators, right? 1 to each platform and mezzanine to street. Berlin is island platform land for the most part, so it's 1. Makes things here easier. But you see that the numbers here, the numbers that are written here are not 3. It's 4 or 5. Manuel Becerra is 7 because it's a transfer station. But these are not mostly transfer stations. These are stations where they do 4 instead of 3 elevators. This means that you have more redundancy. And you know something? There's nothing inherently terrible with redundancy. You can do 4 or 5. When when Madrid does 4 or 5, yeah, I can understand that. Maybe you want more redundancy. Maybe you have multiple entrances at the station. Let's say 1 at the front, 1 at the back, and you want both of them to be accessible. So this means you need more elevators. And again, that's not a bad thing. And again, I have no objection to the fact. Now, this is even though I can tell you how Madrid could be doing this for a lot less than 330 million euros, because again, most of these numbers, if you were trying to go minimum, instead of 4, or 5, these numbers would be 3. I don't know whether Manuel Becerra can be done for sub-7. So maybe instead of 330, it's 250, or maybe in the limit even 200. Now, if Madrid does this, this is fine. Do you know why? Because Madrid is about to because Madrid is something like 70% accessible, and it's about to close half of the gap by 2028, and the rest will be done by the early 30s. And this is fine because Madrid can actually do it. Berlin, same thing. Not New York City. Absolutely not New York City. New York City is about 1/4 accessible. I think maybe at this point, maybe 30% actually. New York City has absolutely no excuse to do more than the minimum, which is 1 elevator. If you're worried about reliability, get a better elevator maintenance contract, because when you do that, the reliability of 1 well-maintained elevator is more than that of 2 poorly maintained ones. In Boston, the elevator uptime rose from, I believe, 82 or 83% to 99% when they got a better, which I think also cost more, elevator maintenance contract. Essentially, they got a standard elevator maintenance contract with one of the standard vendors instead of trying to fidget things on their own. And and maybe there was a higher cost per elevator, but remember, the reliability of 1 elevator at 99% is like 2 at 90%, right? and is much better than 2 at low 80s. Let me actually check the logs on this, right? Because if the elevator, if your uptime is 85%, then you're 15% of the time you're in an outage, and even 2 elevators will have will between them, if it's independent, have an uptime of 98%. Now, if you have 3, it's 99.7%, but you're not doing 3 for redundancy. That would be ridiculous. And the point is that if you can do half as many elevators just because of redundancy issues, that's half of your installation and maintenance costs. So even if your maintenance cost per elevator has risen, your overall maintenance costs will have fallen from essentially doing better preventive maintenance. And this means that, again, Madrid can do this. I do not object to Madrid doing this set. I do object to New York City doing that at stations where, if they're so shallow, 2 would be enough. If they have a mezzanine, 3. This is excessive compliance. It's people saying, oh, we should have high-level accessibility with redundancy, so we should do extra. If you're New York City, you do not have the budget margin for extra because there's a fixed budget for accessibility. And if you do 4 elevators at 1 station, it's at the expense of doing 2 elevators at 2 stations. And remember, Madrid, nearly all of the important stations there are already accessible, and a large fraction of the unimportant ones. And soon it's going to be everything, and the same is even true of Berlin. New York is nowhere near there. New York needs to just get the number of accessible stations to levels that don't make me think of giving it an award for Action T4. And if people don't know what Action T4 is, because you're not as obsessed with reading about genocide as me, this is Action T4. I have sometimes thought about doing Action T4 awards for inaccessible public infrastructure, which I'm sad to say would be on Metro Inaccessibility 1, not by New York, but by Paris. In Paris, they said, oh, it's 15 million euros to make a station accessible. We don't have 5 million euros to make 300 stations accessible, so let's not do it. Yeah, that's Paris. And if you're wondering if 15 is the correct number, remember that Madrid is, with this little bit of extra, generally less than that. Your decision how much you trust Parisians when they say that they can't. So this is an example of, this is actually more malicious, I think, in the case of New York. I haven't really seen this done in places that take accessibility more seriously, except at the very end. So in Boston, a city which is a lot less malicious toward people with disabilities, nearly every subway station is accessible. The surface streetcar sections of the Green Line are not generally accessible, but the 3 lines that don't go into streetcar mode, I think between them there's maybe 2 stations that are inaccessible. So Boston is almost entirely accessible. Part of it is that they did a lot of reconstruction in the 1980s, but even the older stations they retrofit. Again, there are 2 missing stations. One is this one, Wollaston. They're about to make it accessible, and it's much more expensive than the norm. It's 40 million. Normally in Boston it's 20. I believe it's because it's an at-grade station for the most part. So the issue with the station being mostly at grade is that normally, if the station is elevated, then you go underneath and you put an elevator to the platform. Whereas if it is, you see how there's this kind of over and under access. So this is essentially the way that they need to do it with elevators. I imagine this and this are elevators. So this is, again, a $40 million project because they need more elevators than you would expect. It's kind of weird. You'd expect that at-grade stations are the easiest, but they're actually the hardest because they need more elevators. This is not excessive compliance. This is just Massachusetts having tighter regulations, and the way it's been explained to me that specific regulation actually makes sense. It's called path of travel, and this means that you are allowed to make wheelchair users go through slightly longer paths of travel because you have ramps, and if you have ramp switchbacks, then they do involve a longer distance spent than if you're just walking up steps. But there's a limit to how much you're allowed to do it. I believe the limit is 400 meters, a quarter of a mile, and especially if the entrance is already kind of funky like here, then it's very easy to just run up against the limit, and you have to do elevators and not ramps. It's kind of weird how in that case a fully trenched station or an elevated station would be easier. Like if the platform were not here, but if the platform were at Beale Street right here, you would be able to just sink a ramp, and it should be okay. But the platform is not here; it's here, and yes, you can do this as a path of travel, but you would need to build an entirely new entrance. I'm not even sure that this road has. Remember 1 in 13? Sometimes the roads, the roads and the sidewalks are not compliant with that. So again, this is tight regulations. Once again, I can understand why they're tight. You want things to be accessible in practice and not just in theory. I guess this is not going to by itself valid path of travel. It's just you need to essentially build abutments for the entire ramp, and it might be annoying. So this is, again, it's a tight rule, but Massachusetts has made it work. It's, again, $20 million per station. It's not good or anything, but remember, Paris thinks it's the same to build there as in Boston. There are procurement problems that are completely separate from this. Boston does have procurement problems. It's America. So I said Boston is missing 2 stations. I started explaining the problems with Boston. The other is Bowdoin. The issue with Bowdoin is that, first of all, there's another station on the same line this close, Government Center. It's so close that you could literally get from a Government Center exit to Bowdoin without hitting path of travel, possibly. And also, because Google Earth will not quite show you where the lines go. The blue line goes from Bowdoin along this route that I'm going over with my mouse, and here it goes above ground. You can see the line already. So this is the path of the blue line. The path of the red line is South Station, and then under Summer Street here, and then it goes here to Charles Station. It goes above ground, and you can see. So the blue and the red don't actually meet; they're parallel. Only pair of Boston subway lines that don't intersect. There are plans to extend the blue line on Cambridge Street to Charles MGH just for the connection. It's called the Red Blue Connector. I hope Boston builds it. I hope it can do it for a reasonable price. This would probably entail the closure of Bowdoin, just because, again, it's 200 something meters from Government Center. There's no real reason for the station to exist. So because the station is potentially going to be closed, why are you going to invest in that? However, because they're uncertain, they also have plans to make it accessible in the event it stays open. Again, this is the behavior of a city of a region that does not hate people with disabilities. And remember, it's almost always 1 elevator, not 2. Yeah, some of the last filling the gap projects are 2 because maybe they think about redundancy, or maybe they think about having every exit covered by an elevator, not just one of them. But again, if it's your last 3 stations, you can afford that. If you're thinking about maybe completing accessibility in the 2050s, then there's no excuse. Just retrofit more stations. Don't be malicious about it. And of course, the people in New York who want more accessibility, they probably think, oh, let's have the highest standards. Because maybe they don't think systematically enough to think we need to have as wide coverage as possible. So this is an example of where people demand things that are not in regulation, that are not about even the concept, because again, it's much better for disabled people to have twice as many stations accessible And yeah, maybe you're spending a bit more per elevator on maintenance if you do proper maintenance, but you should not have outages. You should not have constant outages. Oh, hi. No, American rules don't ever say that you need two elevators. The American rules do not require redundancy. I think the rule is that maybe there's a rule where if the elevator is out, then you're required to provide paratransit service. But in America, you're required to provide paratransit service even if there are elevators. No, I think they should repeal that rule, but it doesn't matter because the paratransit demand doesn't change either way. Hi, Kalidosium. So this is an example of how the accessibility issue has been used to in this case, I think there's actually malicious compliance involved. That, oh, we need two elevators. It's kind of adding more standards. Often maybe not the people hard to do accessibility, but their bosses, they don't care. So because they don't care, they don't manage. So if the person in charge of accessibility wants really high standards and does not set the budget, maybe they'll say, oh, we need, it's good to have redundancy, it may be good to add other things extra. Again, this is the leakage problem. And again, if the managers cared, then they would manage. There's this mentality that maybe if you never say no, it's because you really care, and that's never the case. I mean, parents who love their children tell the children no sometime. I mean, I'm not saying they tell the children no about if the children want something that's reasonable or semi-reasonable, and the parents are just being assholes, and they're not going to just be assholes. Again, I'm saying good parents who love their children, but they do say no to excessive requests. Which parents say yes to everything? The ones who don't care. Again, if the parents believe that something is yes, then it's a yes. I mean, like if you're a 16-year-old tells you, oh, I really love my partner, can I go to their place and have sex? I mean, if your style of parenting is that it's normal for people that age to be having sex, then yeah, and you will say yes and hopefully teach them about protection. But there are things you will say no to them about, and the point is that the managers who don't care never say no. They never say, I like redundancy, but we don't have budget for redundancy. We have budget for this many elevators. We need to make as many stations accessible as possible. And because, again, the managers are malicious, they don't manage, and it is very easy for the budget to get bloated. So this is an example of malicious, and they do accuse the heads of the subway, the MTA in New York, of hating disabled people. Again, not all of them do. Andy Byford made a lot of effort to be better at this, both in terms of how in operations people treat passengers with disabilities, and also how and essentially the plan to keep retrofitting more stations. That was Byford. There's a lawsuit from the 90s and consent decree and so on that said that New York needed to make 100 stations accessible, and then they're not sure what to do beyond the first 100. But the management, the rest of management, they don't care. They essentially hate people with disabilities. And I'm not saying they actively hate them. By analogy, they're not like the Nazis toward the Jews. The Nazis actively hated the Jews. Their attitude toward people with disabilities is more like the attitude of like a casual anti-Semite toward the Jews, someone who maybe finds the Nazis distasteful, but I mean not enough to actually hide Jews in the Holocaust. And so again, this is malicious. Now I'm going to give an example of something that is not malicious, because again, some of the actors that have led to a cost explosion are actively malicious, some are passively malicious. I think I'm trying to remember the name of the TV trope about this. I think they call it Jerk with a Heart of Jerk. Someone who's a completely obstructive bureaucrat who just enjoys saying no, not in the sense of good management of saying no to some things and yes to others, essentially no unless you prove to me beyond even unreasonable doubt that something is not just good, but also within the skill set of the manager themselves. Managers don't want to be replaced by more competent people. Generally, incompetence knows that it's incompetent. I mean, maybe it defines itself as competent in other things. Maybe it's an elite of generalist lawyers. It's a very common thing in America, who don't want to be displaced by technically adept people. and they understand that they're bad at math. They just don't think it's important to be good at math. But they do understand they're bad at math generally. Is the point. The other example I want to give was fire code, because again, there's this false belief in the United States that the high costs come from fire code, a belief that is again encouraged by the second largest developed country, Japan, which has a different, not generally laxer, just different, much more engineering-based fire code, just because a lot of countries are adopting the American fire code, that Japan is trying to sell as an alternative. And this is an example of, again, it's poor management, but it's specifically, there are these fire codes. Okay, in America, it's NFPA 130. It's adopted, I think, US-wide. And then, from time to time, the fire department in a city might say, no, we want more than that. And again, nobody ever pushes back. Nobody ever says, no. Nobody says, you do that and it will not get funded. And it's always the going beyond, because the letter of the American fire code is not actually unreasonable. I mean, the Japanese critique of it is that it's too vague. This does lead to problems because often people will demand certain interpretations of the fire code. An example of this, not for subway stations, but for buildings, is that, this is where I'm going to try looking for different footprints of buildings, and when I give up, maybe I should not have like a Holocaust reference on Wikipedia. I'm done comparing people with the Nazis, I think. Maybe let me try to show you buildings, and I hope that I'm gonna land on correct ones, because this is pretty random. So I'm gonna show you a random new buildings in Berlin, and hope that they are what I think they are. So how do we know that these are modern? This is because the wall was around here, so these would presumably be new buildings. This looks like a new building to me, actually. I also think this is a commercial building, so maybe not the best. So I'm gonna measure something about this building, and if it doesn't work, then I'm gonna say it's because it's commercial and look for actual residential buildings. So start here and go parallel. It's about 15 meters, maybe 14 point something. I think the standard width of a building in Berlin is around 14 meters. These are commie blocks. How wide are these commie blocks? Or rather, it's commie blocks that have been rebuilt to look like there is no longer an iron curtain, so they look nicer. Yeah, these are even narrower. I think there's like 11 or 12 meters. Again, the standard in Berlin is about 14. Again, commie blocks may be narrower. These look like old buildings. I think in all of this it's about 14. Of course, it doesn't mean that it's 14 with a bunch of wings, but 14. And the difference is that in the United States and in Canada, when you have mid-rise buildings like this, it's usually 20. Now, there are people who have turned into an entire moral panic about about apartments that don't have enough rooms, which I don't think is the correct way to view it. This is my standard example of this in the United States, and the reason is that this specific building is new. I think it's from maybe 10 years ago, and it should not have been built because this is actually a good place to build high-speed rail. The building is too valuable to... you can knock down the building if you absolutely have to. You don't need to just go around it. But essentially, it's this building or a bunch of single families. This building is bigger. And you might even be able to tell that this building is just much wider. I believe it's 21. And we're actually going to check this because I never remember this. So we start here. We go across... Yep, about 21 meters. So if you're wondering what this means... Oh, hi, hi. What this means is that the way American multifamily buildings like this work is that they have a central corridor running roughly down the middle. It's kind of hotel style. And then the apartment is going to... And I imagine they're going to try to have the inner spaces used for elevators. because these are spaces just are not going to have windows, but maybe they're partly populated, I'm not sure. And so long corridors, kind of hotel style. You know when you go to when you stay at a hotel, like a chain hotel, so maybe so nothing funky. There's a central corridor and there are rooms on both sides, and there's going to be a window at the end of the room, and usually there's going to be a bathroom near the door. Just because the bathroom doesn't need a window and the bedroom part does, and this is kind of how these buildings look. Obviously, the apartments are much bigger. They're not intended to be hotel rooms. It's also related to the American expectation that every bedroom should have a bathroom. It's partly wealth, but it's also partly filling in space. Just because the depth of these apartments is very large. These apartments are 9.5, sometimes even 10 meters wide. I've seen cases of apartments that are even 12 meters, not wide, 12 meters deep, because of this central corridor. And in Germany, that doesn't exist. Now, I'm not saying that in Germany the window frontage to area ratio, the opposite of that, area to window frontage ratio is that much smaller, because you've seen the wings, and I mean the wings just create more spaces are like this, there are no windows. But again, the width is about 14 meters, so if there were no wings, the depth would be about 7. And the upshot is that we don't have these so this thing where you have the long central corridor with apartments and what's called double loaded corridor. And this is a very North American thing. Again, it exists outside North America, but it's mostly hotels. Multifamily buildings don't have that. They have something called point access, where a building like this would have probably about 6 entrances. The entrance goes here. There's a single stairway, 1 elevator here, and then probably 4 apartments. If it's France, 1, 2, 3, 4. And if it's Germany, it's going to be 2 apartments going 1 and 2. The other thing you could do is, so point access is just illegal in the United States, because the only way you make it work is if you have only 1 staircase, and American fire codes require 2. This is just something that needs to be repealed. But that, I should say, depends on the state, and in New York State it's allowed to have scissor stairs, so this essentially means that there's the same, there are 2 staircases but they kind of wrap around each other, if that makes sense. So they just don't consume as much space. It's important for high rises at least. Mid rises again should just be single stair. But the other thing, so the point access is just is illegal to essentially do in any cost-effective way in the United States. But the other thing that I'm going to talk about is called the single loaded corridor, and that is legal, but it's not within tradition, because it's not within tradition in New York. An attempt at doing that. A double helix, as if it were strand of DNA, exactly. And I mean, I don't have, and because it's a digression, I didn't prepare, for example, tweets, or generally images about how this works. I'm going to try to look around California, because the single loaded corridor is actually common in California, but only for hotels. Because it's and I'm going to try, it's a hotel that I stayed at once that I have not very good chance of finding. I think it was around, it was in Thai Town. Relatively near Hollywood Boulevard, I don't remember where. Maybe it's actually here. Is this building? Because you're not going to have, yep, might actually be the hotel, yeah. So this is a single loaded corridor, I believe. Where I imagine, if it's not this hotel, then it's a hotel in this style. So the way this works is, you see this corridor for access. This is how you access the rooms. So you access a room from this end. I don't remember the hotel that I was at having windows in both ends, so maybe there's a single loaded corridor on the other side or something. Actually, probably just because of this does look rather wide, but it's something that you can do with or maybe not. Maybe there wasn't. I just don't remember. Because you see, this is very narrow. This is not like 9. This is like 8 or 9 meters. So this would just be windows on both sides. So you have through breeze. And of course, in California, in LA, the weather is so mild you can even tell people that they're going to just walk on this external corridor. And but it's also common in Japan, which does not have an especially mild climate. At any rate, the single loaded corridor, the way I just showed you, this is a small building. It's like 2 floors, maybe 3. But it is, again, it's used even for high-rise things in Japan. I think up to, I don't remember, I think I've seen 12 floors. Again, it is legal to do this in New York. I want to make it very clear. There are fire codes in New York. The fire codes in New York are less stringent than in California. I don't think it's because of earthquakes. Just in New York, scissor stairs are permitted, and in California, I believe they're not. And so the single loaded corridor is legal in New York. However, it is not within tradition. And maybe it's because of the way the American fire codes are written to be rather open to interpretation. Again, that's the substance of the Japanese critique. Or just because it's a bunch of city bureaucrats who don't want to think about things that they're not used to. There was a case that I've heard of through Stephen Smith where a developer did manage to push a single loaded corridor through. The single loaded corridor is very powerful because on the one hand, you can build it with a thinner building where you have windows on both sides of the unit, so you have cross ventilation. The double loaded corridor's main drawbacks are lack of cross ventilation and a lot of wasted space on corridors, often 15% of the area of each floor. And in LA, for some high-rises, I've seen numbers that approach 20%, are not rentable. It's going to be elevators, chute space, corridor space, which is horrific. Just to put things in perspective, the European, the traditional European point access with an elevator consumes about 25 square meters, maybe 30 square meters of each floor. So if you have even 2 moderately sized apartments, that's, I don't know, that's 15% of the apartments are small. If it's too large-ish, like family-size apartments, then it's sub 10%. If it's 4, where again more common in France, where you lose cross ventilation, it's barely 5%. So just so much more efficiency out of this. And again, lack of cross ventilation. The single loaded corridor essentially just costs you less to build because it's outside. So in terms of materials, ventilation, air heating, air cooling, heating needs, it's just much cheaper space to build than interior. And also you keep the cross ventilation. And so this is again something that I think is a very valuable way of building and should be used more often for just higher quality, higher efficiency buildings. This, unfortunately, again, it's not in tradition in New York, and therefore the example that I know of, I can't tell you where it was. Oh my God, this is terrible, and I am sorry, Sami. And anyway, the way that it happened is the building was built. Again, I don't know where it was, so I can't show you. But the developers caught so much grief that the extra compliance costs for something that, again, is legal in New York. They didn't need to modify regulations. They just needed the regulators to be familiar with their own regulations and not be puzzled about something that again is uncommon in New York. The tradition in New York is point access, and then depending on how renovated the building is, 2 to 4 apartments per building. This is for interior blocks. So interior blocks, and I'm gonna do, it's East Village, but at the time these were built, nobody called it the East Village, it was the Lower East Side, thank you very much. So this is an old law tenement, recognizable by the fact that it has a little bit of an indent to provide windows here. Windows that did not offer meaningful views, look at how close they were to the next building, but did technically offer sunlight. Also, people tended to throw trash through the windows, so these filled with trash, and the laws were then modified for trash removal, for something called New Law. So these buildings would have been 1880s, 90s, because Old Law 1879, New Law 1901. These were point access, no elevators, because it's 1880 something, 1890 something, and these people are all poor. I mean, poor in New York City, which is at the time probably the richest. Maybe if it's not the richest city in the world, then it's number 2 after London. But again, poor people, immigrants who are Italian, maybe Jewish, probably Jewish because it's Lower East Side. Probably an entire family will live in an apartment about this size. But again, point access, nearly all of the area was rentable. The developers were trying to maximize rentable area because when you have an entire family living in, I don't know, 40 square meters, let me actually check. The tradition would be, I don't actually know how big this building would be, but the typical building was 20 feet of frontage by 100 or almost 100 of depth. So 2,000 square feet, 200 square meters. Each apartment would be 50 minus a little bit for the point access. And again, very little of it would have been point access because when you have an entire family living in 45 square meters, even extraordinarily poor people who speak poor English and are speaking Yiddish and just came fleeing a pogrom in Odessa, would rather live in a place where there's a little bit more space. So again, the New York tradition is point access. It's not really being used anymore because essentially because nowadays you need 2 elevators. These not 2 elevators, 2 staircases. These have 0 elevators, 1 staircase. It's all grandfathered. So because it's not even in tradition in New York to build single loaded corridors, they had problems with us. Yeah, that actually makes a lot of sense. I mean, like it's so I will say that the East Village. So by the way, okay, 2 things. Sani. Double helix style with 1 elevator each for odd and even floors is rather horrific. Often old buildings with elevators had these elevators that don't stop every floor. Singaporean HDBs, the elevators stop every other floor. I've even seen a Harvard dorm to expect for very wealthy people. People with very high family income, and they stick them in this building where the elevator stops every 3rd floor. And I actually lived in a building like that in Berlin for 2 years. It's like a 19th century building where I think the elevator stopped on the 2nd and 4th floor. And most people had at least 1 flight of stair up or down. And by the way, back to your Jewish friends, New York family. Just to give background to people who don't know the ethnic history of New York City, it's unlikely that your Jewish friend's New York family has continuously lived in this area. So the history is, this is a poor, legendarily overcrowded, potentially the most. There's a chance that the Lower East Side, which again nobody called the East Village at that time, this is a gentrifier name. So this area roughly was the densest, the highest population density concentration of people in this rough area ever. Now, Kohlenwald City was more than that, but the Kohlenwald City had, I think, 30,000 people. It was very small. This was big, and of course the freeway did not exist then. So I don't actually know what happened. I imagine everything this housing project were poor, mostly Jewish, maybe some Italian immigrants lived. So this is 3.5 square kilometers. I think there were like 500,000 people living here. And some sections were more density than that. Anyway, this is late 19th, early 20th century. The subway opens 1904. Population of the village, I believe, not the village, Lower East Side, I believe, peaks 1910. this area depopulates fast because people don't actually like living an entire family to a 45 square meter apartment. Thank you very much. So that's when they move up to, if it's Jews, probably Upper West Side. So this is 1930s, 40s, a working class but upwardly mobile Jewish area. Washington Heights. All these were the first step we went. It went like this. Maybe they moved to Brooklyn. Places like Coney Island, Midwood, Williamsburg. And the Forest Hills, traditionally Jewish area, that's actually stayed traditionally Jewish, this entire area. So again, nobody actually wants to live here because it's an overcrowded area. It's good, very poor. So essentially there's been full replacements. So if you have a Jewish family in this area, it's unlikely the entire descent was in the area. Most likely what happens is they moved out, maybe to the Upper West, and then they became middle class, and maybe by the 1950s, 60s, this area starts being more acceptable for respectable people to live in, and then they move back. Or maybe it's even a generation later, and maybe they also spent a generation in the suburbs, and essentially became white Americans. So, or like normal white, I mean, obviously the Jews were white Americans in 1900, right? The US had immigration laws that forbade people who were not white or black from ever being US citizens. So Indian immigrants, for example, could not naturalize. They were denaturalized in a court ruling. I think 1920. There were like some groups had to go to court to prove they're white people, like the Finns. And Jews were considered white. White people, it's okay to kill from time to time, but white people. And when they became normal, like more normal white Americans, that's in 1950s, 60s, they moved to where normal white Americans lived at the time, which was increasingly the suburbs, and then normal white Americans, some Jewish, some not, moved to Jewish areas like the Upper West Side. Same way that normal white Americans moved to traditionally Italian areas, parts of Williamsburg, or traditionally Polish areas, Greenpoint, traditionally Greek areas like Astoria. And again, I mean, this is old neighborhoods, and places like, again, Forest Hills, Rego Park, these only became, this only kind of opened to mass housing when the subway was built here. This is 1930s, so this is maybe where the Jews moved in the 1940s, 50s, and by then you're starting to get people who have continuously lived in this area. Oh yeah, okay, sorry if I'm explaining, but I think most people who watch this don't live in New York. Do I think most apartments, okay, good question. Can most apartments be retrofitted? Yeah, you can retrofit old buildings with apartments. Not with apartments, sorry, with elevators. This is often not done. Why is it not done? First of all, if you have a very small point access, which again you do in these old buildings in New York, then there's often no room for an elevator. Second, certainly the old law tenements, if you can actually retrofit them, probably the most profitable strategy, seriously, the most profitable strategy since the new law was passed, so since 1901, is to build them like this. This is a new law tenement. You see there's more space here, and presumably there's also means that per the new law, there would be doors here and here, or here and here, for trash removal from these areas. But you do see that this is a bigger building, as wide as 2 buildings. So the new law tenements tended to be built either in areas that had never been built old law, maybe because the area did not have good transport access until after the new law passed, like in all of uptown Manhattan, or they were corner lots, so they were already bigger and more valuable to redevelop. This is a rare example of redevelopment in an interior block, but often you need to buy 2 or even 3 of them at once and knock them down. This might be difficult because of laws on historic preservation against the historic area, by American standards at least. by the standards of where I live, it's not especially historic. I mean, also Berlin is not a poor, it's not Berlin's a, it's not Berlin is a poorly preserved city. It's not even the war. At least I don't think it's the war. Paris, but not really touching the war, and is also poorly preserved from before Osman. And so probably what you would want to do is not do some kind of retrofit in place, but take this entire row. This is pre-law. You recognize that this is pre-law because these buildings don't have the indentation. So this is before windows were required in every bedroom, and they're also shorter. Whereas the old law will fill the entire almost the entire block. And so you take a row of these, you knock down all of these buildings, you rebuild based on modern standards. And instead of building 5-story buildings in Manhattan, and not even the cheap, there's no cheap part of Manhattan, but this is one of the more expensive parts of Manhattan. You build it as if the laws permitted this, if the zoning laws permitted, you build it like this with one elevator and something, and then ideally 50 floors. Again, you can build more than 5 floors. All the people here who think that the city has been going downhill since they were 25, then they will yell at you. But this is what you should be doing here. Just again, rebuilding much taller and denser. Again, this is Manhattan we're talking about. This is not a village. It may be called the East Village, but this is because this area was once called the Village, Greenwich Village. And they started giving other places names of village too, because the village gentrified was literally the first neighborhood in the world, perhaps. Certainly the first in the United States that gentrified. This was 1920s and 30s. Jane Jacobs, I believe, moved in 1935. She was completely a gentrifier. So other neighborhoods were starting getting names like Village, like East Village, for what was up until that point just called Lower East Side, to make it sound fancier. So yeah, accessibility and new standards, yes, you can absolutely do this, but often you would prefer to just knock down the building. Often the same historic preservation laws would make it difficult for you to do the retrofits, because here's something that you should absolutely retrofit. American windows slide. They open like this. Windows where I live open like this. They're hinged. They're tilt and turn, so it's generally very well insulated. My apartment is currently unheated. The last time I turned on the heating in my apartment, I'm forgetting whether it was in 2021 or January of 2022. We will discuss whether it's okay to heat an apartment with gas when Putin retreats behind the officially recognized borders of the countries that he invades. But it's not that I'm making some kind of huge sacrifice. I don't actually know what the interior temperature in my apartment is. I am guessing high teens, low 20s. It's about freezing outside. So in New York that never happens. Even the modern tilt and turn sometimes is a little less insulated, but generally American windows are poorly insulated. They need to be replaced. Unfortunately, often this is illegal under historic preservation laws because the slide windows are more historic. This is not, of course, Celsius. I don't speak Fahrenheit. I do speak Fahrenheit, but I mentally convert. No, it is not. The temperature in my... Okay, you can see what I'm wearing. You can see that you cannot see my breath. Yeah, the temperature is not 20 degrees Fahrenheit, because 20 degrees Fahrenheit is -7 Celsius, and when it's -7 Celsius, you see your breath. I want to say you see your breath when it's freezing, but maybe a little above freezing. Certainly at -7. And I would not. And it's cold when I'm like this, and it's freezing. So yeah, but anyway, the point is not about New York accessibility. The point is that, or about New York building standards, is that these are often interpreted in usually conservative ways, sometimes out of malice, sometimes out of incompetence. The latter is more common than the former. Probably the most common kind of incompetence in this case, certainly in New York, but really in the entire United States, is a specific kind of incompetence, which is not what I said before about lawyers who hate math and resent people who know math better than they do, but in curiosity. So you tell an American that something works in Europe, they don't care. They look down on Europe. Europeans don't have large enough SUVs for them to want to be European. And the upshot is that this is not the law. It's not the law. The laws in the United States are very rarely the problem. The ones that I can identify to you certain laws in the United States that are the problem for construction costs, but these are not US-wide laws. These are something that one governor, often Andrew Cuomo, tried doing just because he thought it would be better. For example, the design-build law in New York. And even that law is somehow less bad than it seems. Not because the law was not bad. It is a terrible law. It's just that it just so happens that the Disbedeinbeld, people don't know what Disbedeinbeld means. Design build means one contract is design and construction. Design bid build means design is one contract, then you bid it to a builder, so two contracts. Disbedeinbeld is, and I'm not going to talk about this presentation, about the slide deck, because, as I said, I mean it's up there somewhere. This is Disbedeinbeld. In Turkey, they do two contracts, which is normally design bid build, but instead of design bid build, you design 60%, so it does. You bid it to someone who will go from 60 to 100%, the ein, and then build. Disbedeinbeld in most of the United States considered design bid build, but apparently in New York it's considered design build variant and is legal. So while trying to ban good procurement, New York accidentally failed to ban good procurement. So again, usually it's specific Cuomo things or some very recent bad reforms related to the global aid system. For the most part, the problem is not the law, it's how it's interpreted. The interpretation, I don't think I've ever no, I've heard it called centigrade. I'm pretty sure nobody who uses Celsius calls it Celsius. I'm pretty sure centigrade is how people who use Fahrenheit call Celsius. But anyway, or people who just switched 5 days ago, like in Australia or something, and still think in Fahrenheit. So anyway, the issue is how the law is interpreted. And again, the interpretations are in some cases malicious. This is not the general case. This is specific to people who don't want certain things to happen. This is common in some commuter rail modernization projects. I suspect the Toronto RER project, the rail modernization project for commuter rail in Toronto, suffers from that. But I will say that in Boston, I have not seen this kind of malicious incompetence. In Boston, it's, I think, just normal incompetence. In New York, it's the case for accessibility. It's for things that people just don't want to do. The other case is some petty actor, like the fire department, will step in and say that they want more than the regulations say. Essentially, it's a nice to have and they're not paying, so why not? And essentially nobody pushes back. Nobody says, nobody tries to tell them, the law says you don't need two means of egress, only one. And we will not fund it if you demand more money. We have money, we being, let's say, the state government or the federal government, you don't. They never say that. They never push back. It's uncouth to push back. American society has weird notions of politeness, I will say. It's like not consensus in the Nordic model. It's not yelling at your inferiors like in Finland, which is normally Nordic, but not in that sense. It's not the bureaucrat said something, you do it, like in Japan or in Italy. It's weird. It's where essentially you're trying to pretend that you don't have a government. That's America. This is what I want to talk about, this issues of over-compliance when someone else is paying. Again, literally none of the people doing this over-compliance are paying for this. Remember, in New York for the excessive number of elevators, yeah, the MTA is paying, but the MTA doesn't care about the project. So from its perspective, it's paying an amount of money that has been determined by a judge. They hate the judge. They hate the disability advocates who sued. They're not going to try to make it more efficient. For the fire code, the fire department never pays. The municipality that gives the fire department its full backing never pays. Often it's people who interpret things based on a tradition. It's kind of weird how Americans keep saying things like we're a nation of laws, and when it comes to infrastructure, the United States is not a nation of laws. It's a nation. I wouldn't say a nation of lawyers, but it's not lawyers. It's there's this line in The Expanse, right at the beginning of both the first book and the first season of the show, which is there are no laws on series, only cops, and the United States is a little bit like that when it comes to these kind of engineering regulations. And I mean, I've heard often from Americans that rule of law is good, and lo and behold, here's an aspect where the United States is unusually poor level of rule of law, and also the United States has unusually poor outcomes. I mean, like in the abstract, the Americans are right. It's just that they're often bad at implementing their own standards, like their own also engineers, but also like their philosophical standards of the government should work. I think I'm done with the example that I was going to go into. You already see me talk a lot about buildings, and neighborhood and ethnic history of New York. So, do people have questions? You don't think I need this? Yeah, you see the flash where sorry, this is with me trying to see how flat, because when I'm seeing something that's not OBS, I'm not seeing how my face looks. I just need to see here yep, when I'm seeing something that's very bright, I do flash. Oh yeah, thanks for watching. Glad you enjoyed it. Do other people have questions? What's the lag? Well, now it's frozen, but when it's not frozen, what's the lag? Ugh, I hate lag. I hate it when I lag. Here it is. 12 second lag, okay. Yeah, I should cover Southeast Asia better. It's just that with Southeast Asia... Okay, so I can rant about Singapore, but that's usually what I saw in the slide deck that I briefly went over about the globalized system. Like, essentially there's the Singapore problem, which is Singapore, Hong Kong, and then Britain, Singapore, and Hong Kong kind of jointly developed how to build infrastructure too expensively and with too many overheads, but at least the overheads are going to people who went to Oxbridge. And I'm not saying Oxbridge or their equivalent to Singapore and Hong Kong, because the equivalent of Oxbridge to Singapore and Hong Kong is Oxbridge. I think at this point China is the number one country for foreign students at both Oxford and Cambridge, but this is very recent. And like even 10 years ago, I think it was Singapore and Hong Kong, and then maybe just behind was China. And think how many people live in Singapore and Hong Kong, and how many people live in China. The rest of Southeast Asia is just... I should maybe talk more about... maybe I should talk more about the issue of poor public transportation in developing countries. I wrote a blog post about that, but the issue of people thinking that, oh, it's poor countries, they don't drive there because it's only rich people who drive there. And they actually look at car ownership in Bangkok, and pretty sure Bangkok has substantially higher car ownership than Berlin. Or Kuala Lumpur has model splits that exist in the United States outside New York. I don't think they exist in rural America outside New York, but Kuala Lumpur is also not rural, thank you very much. Kuala Lumpur, I think, has the same model split as San Francisco. And I don't mean San Francisco proper, I mean the entire Bay Area. Kuala Lumpur is just very auto-oriented, Bangkok. I think Manila and Jakarta are poorer, but not very good. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Indonesia is a very poorly known country for. I guess the issue is that Indonesia, like Indonesia is what? It's about as rich as China, but like China is very obtrusive, not because it's large. I mean, you see Chinese products everywhere. You don't see Indonesian products. I mean, nobody ever. I mean, I'm about the only person who looks at the country of origin when I buy clothes because I'm trying to, as far as possible, not buy from the PRC. And then I see, oh, made in Pakistan, made in Bangladesh, made in India, made in Vietnam, made in the Philippines, made in Cambodia, maybe made in Indonesia, of course. Um, but I don't think people see like anything as prestigious as Chinese exports, and so I don't mean socks. I mean masks. I mean corona tests. I mean things like that. I'm out of most of Southeast Asia, so yeah, I should maybe talk about this more, but not now. I'm sorry. Um, so are there other questions before we break off? Yeah, you were the first person with the Indonesia role, but I mean, yeah, I mean, I will say that my specific Discord is very US and European. It also has very little rich Asia. Um, oh, thank you. Um, I'm glad you liked it. So yeah, I think I'm back to a normal schedule, so you should see me again on Tuesday. Um, Maybe that's going to be the Southeast Asia video, I'm not sure, but we'll see. But anyway, thank you, and ciao ciao. I'll see you in 3 days, minus however many hours, minus an hour and a half.